Welcome to this short conversation with Dr. Andrew Pinsent, who is the Research Director at the Ian Ramsey Center for Science and Religion in Oxford, and the keynote speaker at the upcoming conference organized by the Swedish network Kristna i Akademin, or Christians in the Academy. This conference will take place on the 2nd and 3rd of October and has the theme, The True, the Good and the Beautiful as Sources of Knowledge. There will be one public session available for everyone who is interested, and that will be streamed online. A link to this session, which is a talk by Andrew Pinsent, will be available at the Facebook page of the network, as well as on the network's webpage. And links to the Facebook page as well as to the homepage will be available in the descriptions for this video. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Pinsent, for agreeing to do this interview.
Thank you, very happy to be here.
Good. Before we let you give a short introduction or teaser to your talk at the conference, I thought it might be interesting for the viewers to get to know something about you and your daily work. So I wonder if you would like to tell us something about your academic background and what led you into studying the relationship between science and religion.
Sure, very happy. My original discipline was physics, and I studied physics at Oxford, and then I studied particle physics, a doctorate in particle physics at Oxford. And Oxford, like many universities across Europe, builds equipment and writes software for the CERN laboratory in Geneva. So I went out there to get the data for my experiment. I worked on something called the Large Electron Positron Collider, and I was basically smashing particles in Geneva. And after that, that was rather fun. But then I spent 7 years in business. I then did a cost-benefit analysis. In business, we make things, by and large, that don't have lasting value. I make a partial exception for Volvo cars. I'm a great fan of Volvo cars. But most things we make in business don't last very long, right? And we have to work very hard in business to generate things that vanish away very fast. I had a strong sense I was called to become a priest, and I didn't know where priests came from. I'm a Roman Catholic. I went to ask a priest, where do you come from, right? And he said, well, you've got to speak to a bishop. And so after many interviews, I started training as a priest at the Venerable English College in Rome, and there I studied philosophy, and I got 2 degrees in philosophy. And then after that, I studied theology. Then I did another doctorate in philosophy. So basically, I've had a very long and expensive education. And I've been lucky enough to study what I call philosophy or theological philosophy and science at a very high level. And the job at Oxford is ideal for my interests. So that's why I come to be at Oxford today.
Okay, thank you. And you work, as we said, at the Ian Ramsey Center for Science and Religion, and the Ian Ramsey Center is one of a few centers around the world dedicated to study the relationship between science and theology. And for some people, perhaps especially secular people, that might sound like a bit of an esoteric object of study or a bit strange. How do you actually study the relationship between science and theology? Could you say something about what it is that you do at the Ian Ramsey Center?
What do we
do?
The answer is anything we like. And that's the great thing about it, because if you've got a title, Science and Religion, you can cover most big questions under that heading. And I'm a great believer that universities should be gardens and not machines. So unlike making Volvo cars, we don't have a precise objective when we start. We explore this garden of ideas, we make unusual connections. And the thing about the Ian Ramsey Center is we've got unusual liberty to explore, and our only limitations are our own interests and expertise. So we don't restrict the ambit that much. We don't restrict the scope that much at all. We want academic rigor, but we tend to explore big topics that have some relevance and pertinence to science and philosophy and theology. I can explain my own topic. I work a lot on something called the second person relationship, the I-thou relationship, which was made famous by a Jewish philosopher called Martin Buber. And I also study autistic spectrum disorder, which is largely characterized by loss of that relationship or partial loss of that relationship, the I-thou relationship. And this is an incredible toolkit for theology, because the great change in the world brought about by the Judeo-Christian covenant with God is this sense of second person relationship to God. So there's a great change. The Greek philosophers talked about God quite a lot. They say God is good and God is perfect and God is eternal and God is living, but they never addressed God as you. Never addressed God as you. And 7 centuries later, at the end of the Roman Empire, a very brilliant man called Augustine was saying, "Late have I loved you, beauty so ancient and so new." The grammar changes. It's a different worldview, and the implications for our civilization are enormous. So the sense of the human being as a person comes largely from that. That has shaped our entire legal tradition. It's shaped the way we do art. So particularly in Christian cultures, we prioritize the face and the hands, because these are the, if you like, the windows of the I-thou relationship. It shapes even how we eat and drink. We live food to our mouths and so on. I could go on about this. It's fun. It's a funny. I always find funny little facts. So the table knife. The table knife was invented by Cardinal Richelieu, a French cardinal, because he didn't want to be assassinated by people with sharp knives in his house. But the idea of a special knife for eating, so that we can eat politely together. Again, it comes out of this idea of this I-thou relationship, which is primary for human beings. So what do I explore? I explore everything, really. But big questions which are at the intersection of science, philosophy, and theology. Many of them deal with the person. Many of them deal with the way we think about the world. It involves entries into art and literature and so on. So we try to have intellectual fun.
If I could just ask a follow-up question on that.
Sure.
I was thinking, I read one of your articles the other day about special divine action and the second person perspective. And it seems to me that you are utilizing a lot of theories from social psychology actually to illuminate what happens in the life of grace or revealed religion. And that's somewhat unusual, it seems to me, to use science to illuminate that aspect of faith. Would you agree?
Well, it's not quite as unusual as you might think. So here's an example from the early church. So there's a word in the Christian creed, homoousios, which means one substance, and that comes from Greek philosophy, which came from the study of plants and living and growing things. It's a kind of biological idea, really, that a living thing has one substance, one principle of formation. So we learned a lot from studying the natural world. But the big frontier today, I think, is the human person, because one thing that's no one would disagree with, I think, is that we are scientific as a species, and we're also very religious as a species. So a lot of the interesting things, the interesting subjects come together, intersect, often with ourselves. And so here we need to look at experimental psychology, and there's some beautiful work that's done today. So things I study, we couldn't have done 50 years ago. So we try to use up-to-date science, absolutely.
Yes, thank you. So it seems to me that a quite common understanding in the secular world, how science and religion relate, is that religion is essentially a form of failed science. It has the same purpose as science, but is hopelessly incompetent in achieving that purpose, and should therefore be left behind in any serious endeavor to understand the world. However, there's been a major strand in the Christian tradition, represented by, for instance, Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, according to which science and theology are complementary, and that is encapsulated, one could say, in the motto, the Thomistic motto, that grace builds upon nature and perfects it. How would you respond to someone who sees religion as a form of failed science? And could you give some example of how you envision that relationship?
I would encourage that person to get out more, as we say in English, and look at the world, look at the many ways knowledge works in the world, look at the many kinds of human endeavors in the world. Because people who say that religion is a failed science have got a very narrow view. They've got a very narrow view of what science is and what human knowledge is. Because in my own subject of physics, we're very good at measuring things, but not everything is a measurement. Human laws, human friendship, human artistic achievement, these are all things that have very little to do with measurement. If people say, well, religion's a failed science, I think it's such a peculiar way of looking at the world. And I think I would encourage someone like that to get a life, go to some beautiful art galleries and learn about other things apart from just measuring things. And then come back and have a conversation in 6 months, and we'll have a more interesting chat. As to what religion does and theology's contribution, I think we're going to talk about that a bit later. I'm very happy to talk about that a bit later.
Yeah, okay, thank you. There is a quite famous quote by the late Pope John Paul II, who said the following: "Science can purify religion from error and superstition. Religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolute. Each can draw the other into a wider world, a world in which both can flourish." I sort of assume that you would tend to agree, being a Catholic priest working in the field that you do. But if you do agree, could you give some examples of how the dynamic might be manifested in history or today?
Yeah, I'll give you an example, a very powerful example. So let's look at the philosophy of materialism. The philosophy of materialism, and it's a very powerful popular philosophy today, and it is often assumed that science just has to be an expression of materialistic philosophies. But if you take materialism seriously, then everything reduces down to material value, including your investments in universities. Now, that has consequences for science, because most of what science does is not materially useful. I worked at CERN. A lot of our work is completely useless. Occasionally, there is a byproduct, like the internet we're using now. I was there at CERN when it started, and it started in the world of particle physics. But we weren't expecting to create the internet and the World Wide Web. We were smashing particles. A lot of the work astronomers do is not of any material benefit whatsoever in the near or medium term future. So if you take materialism philosophy seriously, then a lot of what we do in science would die. And I'll give you a practical example of this: the Chinese Cultural Revolution. In the Chinese Cultural Revolution, which was the, if you like, the deepest depths of insanity of the communist revolution in China. In the Chinese Cultural Revolution, if you were a pure mathematician, you were an enemy of the people, because you consumed material resources, but you didn't produce any material resources. So a lot of pure science suffered in China during the Cultural Revolution. That's changed a bit now, because the madness lessened after Mao Zedong's death particularly, but materialist societies have not been that good at fostering science as we've understood it in recent centuries. A lot of the work we do at Oxford, a lot of the work we do at our best universities in the world is not useful, and it shouldn't be useful. It's a hard sell for politicians, because they think, well, everything must be useful, but actually no. And religion defends the view that not everything that's valuable in life is about material benefit. although ironically, if you pursue a bigger agenda, often you do produce material benefits. And I'll give you one example of that. So you may know who invented genetics. Do you know who invented genetics?
The Francis Watson was, or Gregor Mendel, of course. If you, yeah,
Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel's, I think, and his other profession was a Catholic priest, right? So and we feed the world today because of our ability to understand the genome, and so by pursuing goals that are higher than just material well-being, we often benefit material well-being as well. So I think religion and good philosophy help to, and also the humanities generally, help to cultivate an environment in which science itself will flourish and make better advances than a strictly materialist society.
Okay, but you're using materialistic a bit in the sense of pursuing only economic value, right?
Right, but you see, we have run the experiment a few times. And if you are a materialist, anything is reducible to matter, which can be measured and it can be valued. And we have had materialist societies. And
so you see a connection between the philosophy of materialism and the economic, the view of value as being purely of economic character, so to speak.
Well, the philosophy we follow will affect our financial decisions as a society. That's definitely true.
Yeah.
I'll take an example of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, in its whole existence, produced less Nobel Prizes than one British university, the University of Cambridge. So though they were very good at things the party wanted, like space travel, and later on they did something work in computing and they did nuclear physics, but in general, this was not a society where knowledge was exchanged freely and people explored ideas creatively.
Yeah. If you look at the first part of the quote from John Paul II, he also said that science can purify religion from error and superstition. Yes. Would you agree with that part? And do you see any examples of that?
Oh, yes, yes. So one of the challenges particularly for theology, I'll be more specific than religion generally, it's theology, is that we have to express purported supernatural realities in natural terms. We have to use natural images and metaphors. Sometimes we can make a mistake, or sometimes we can use a narrative or worldview which is only provisional and needs to be revised. I mean, the famous example, probably in Christian history, is geocentrism. So geocentrism, it wasn't a Christian idea, but it was a popular idea in the ancient world, and Christians tend to assume that that was the only way of thinking about the world, or many of them did. And so that had to be set aside, and that was a bit painful because people were used to think about the world in certain ways, and it's very complicated to measure things. So, but in the end, the church said, we need the evidence. That was what they said to Galileo, and the evidence didn't come in for another 2 centuries. But 2 centuries later, it became very clear geocentrism is wrong. Heliocentrism is the correct way of looking at the world. So that was an example, I would say, of purifying religion from error and superstition. And we've been very careful in the biological area with evolution. At least in the Catholic Church, we don't formally pronounce against it. And it's helped us to think about the world perhaps more with God as a gardener than a watchmaker. Until the 19th century, I think it was quite common for believers to think of God as the supreme watchmaker, the supreme designer of the best Volvo car or whatever, right? But actually that's not what Scripture tells us. And the natural world today doesn't seem so much like a machine. It seems much more a place where there's spontaneity and voluntary action, and for human beings, free will. So God is much more involved a gardener than a watchmaker, and that aligns quite nicely with evolution. So I would say that's another area that's ongoing, but that's still an area where we collectively need to be purified, perhaps, of our superstitions.